Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
My parents told me straight to my face that they could not give me even a single dollar for college, not one, and I believed them because, at that point, I had no choice but to accept that my future was going to rest entirely on my own shoulders. Yet I never could have imagined the day would come when those same parents, the ones who let me drown in student debt and minimum wage jobs, would proudly buy my stepmom's daughter, Hannah, a whole house like it was nothing more than picking up groceries on the way home. I remember sitting across from them at the kitchen table after high school graduation, feeling a strange mixture of hope and dread, asking if there was any way they could help me cover tuition, maybe just the first year until I could get some scholarships lined up. And my dad leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said that college was a waste of money for someone like me, that plenty of people got along fine without it, while my stepmom chimed in with her little smile and agreed that it was best I learned independence early because, according to her, the world doesn't hand out freebies. At that moment, I felt a burn in my chest, but I tried to hide it, telling myself they were just being practical, that maybe money really was tight, even though I knew deep down that it was not, because I had seen the vacations, the new cars, and the endless shopping sprees that somehow were never questioned when Hannah wanted them. The unfairness sat like a stone in my stomach, but I swallowed it because I had no other option. I took on part-time jobs, first one and then two at a time, dragging myself through nights of cashier shifts and mornings of unpaid internships just to stay afloat, and every time I heard a friend casually mention how their parents paid their tuition or helped with rent, I would smile on the outside while inside I felt like a second-class citizen in my own family, constantly reminded that I was not worth even the bare minimum of support. What stung more than the money itself was the way they made me feel invisible whenever Hannah was in the room. She was younger than me by 2 years, but she was treated like a queen whose every want was a need and whose every need was a crisis. If she wanted spring break in Cancun, it happened. If she wanted a car, they justified it as helping her stay safe. I was working double shifts at a diner during that same spring break, counting tips to see if I could afford textbooks, while Hannah was posting beach photos from a resort my dad had cheerfully paid for. I told myself to tough it out, that if I just worked harder I could get through college on my own terms, and in a way I did. I filled out scholarship applications late at night in the library, begging strangers on committees to believe in me since my own family would not. Some said yes, most said no, but enough came through to keep me going. Every time I cashed a check for a scholarship or scraped together enough for tuition, I thought maybe someday my parents would realize how much effort I was putting in and show some pride. That day never came. The real breaking point, the moment everything shifted for me, came one summer when I was home between semesters, working mornings at a local office supply store and evenings at a pizza place. I walked into the kitchen one afternoon to grab water before my next shift, and I overheard my dad on the phone with his sister. His voice was bright, cheerful, almost smug, as he bragged about how he and my stepmom had just closed on a small starter house for Hannah, how it was important to set her up for success, how he wanted her to feel secure and not have to worry about money while she was figuring things out. I stood there frozen, staring at the counter, gripping the glass so tightly I thought it might shatter, because in that moment every single excuse, every single, "we just can't afford it," every single dismissal of my struggles, collapsed in on itself and revealed the truth. They could afford plenty, just not for me. I do not think my dad even noticed me standing there, and maybe that was the cruelest part, that I was so irrelevant to his pride and generosity that he did not even feel the need to hide it. When he finally hung up, I asked him directly if it was true, if he had really bought Hannah a house, and he gave me that same crossed arms look as if I was being dramatic, saying that it was just what parents did, that helping her get settled was no different than paying for her braces years ago. I wanted to scream, but instead I just nodded, walked out the door, and went to my shift, carrying pizzas to strangers while replaying his words in my head over and over until I could not tell whether I wanted to cry or explode. That was the day I made a silent promise to myself, one that would shape every decision I made going forward. If they could decide that I was not worth helping when I needed it most, then I would make sure they would never benefit from my success once I built it. They had made it clear that I was on my own, and I accepted it, but I also knew that one day, when the tables turned, they would feel the weight of what they had done, and I would not give them the satisfaction of ever cashing in on me. The months after that promise felt like running a marathon with a backpack full of bricks that I could not set down even to breathe. Because if I stopped for a second, the bills would catch up and the registrar would lock my account, and the dream I had been nursing since middle school would be pronounced dead. So I stitched together a schedule that made no sense to anyone who slept like a normal person. Opening the coffee shop before sunrise, taking classes through the late morning and afternoon, shelving books at the library in the evening, and babysitting on weekends, and while other students debated which elective felt most inspiring, I kept a spreadsheet that was nothing more than columns of rent, tuition, food, and fees. A quiet ledger that asked a single unforgiving question every week: do you have enough to stay enrolled one more day? Friends would tell stories about their parents moving them into dorms with happy photos and care packages, and those huge club store snack bins, and I would nod and smile while I ate pasta at my desk and filled out scholarship applications that asked me to describe hardship in 3 neat paragraphs, which is funny in a grim way because the kind of hardship those forms want is the kind that looks tidy on paper. Not the slow drip of being told you do not deserve help because someone else in the same house needs it more. Every time I thought about calling my dad to ask for a winter coat or textbooks, I remembered his voice telling me I needed to learn independence, and even though I knew he meant independence for me and blank checks for Hannah, I decided to take the literal meaning and built a life around it, which did not look noble or cinematic. It looked like buying used editions with half the pages highlighted by strangers. It looked like turning down social plans because I could not cover dinner. It looked like keeping a little envelope of emergency cash in a drawer and never touching it unless I had no choice, and all the while I made sure to save receipts, bank statements, and copies of every scholarship letter and pay stub because something in me had learned not to trust their narrative, and I wanted proof of my own. There was a weekend in my junior year when my parents actually came to town, and for about 5 minutes I let myself believe they might be there to see me, yet when I met them at the curb the trunk was filled with boxes, and my stepmom chirped that they were just passing through on the way to Hannah's new apartment because she needed furniture, and it made more sense to buy it near campus and drop it off. And then she asked me if I knew a good place for a quick lunch because they were in a hurry. And I heard myself say sure and recommend a diner, and I watched them drive away while I went to my library shift, telling myself not to cry in the stacks because there was a cart of returns and the scanner was temperamental, and if I let myself break down even a little it would turn into a flood I could not turn off. That night I wrote an essay for a scholarship about the concept of family responsibility, and I told the truth without embellishment, and when I got the award letter a month later I taped it inside my closet door where only I would see it, as if to say you are not crazy, what you feel is real, keep going. Graduation should have been a bright point, and in a way it was, not because anyone threw me a party but because I crossed a stage and knew every step had been earned by hours other people never saw. And when my name was called I did not look for my parents in the seats because I already knew they were not there, though later that night I saw my stepmom's post about how proud she was that Hannah had become a homeowner at such a young age, with a caption about stability and good choices, and I realized that these people would keep rewriting reality in public no matter what I did, which made me strangely calm, because if someone is going to lie about you then the only power left is to guard the truth with actions they cannot undo. On that same day, I took out the folder where I had been saving records for years, and I filed my taxes as independent with every scrap of documentation attached, and when the notice came that my parents had tried to claim me as a dependent again, as if I had been eating at their table and sleeping under their roof, I mailed in my proof and waited, and a few weeks later they called me furious because the claim had been rejected and their refund adjusted and some credit they had counted on evaporated like mist. And I listened quietly while they lectured me about family loyalty. Then I told them loyalty is a two-way street and hung up, and even though that was not fireworks or a viral moment, it felt like the first real piece of justice I had carved out with my own hands. After that call, I sat on my bed in a room that smelled faintly of cardboard boxes because I was moving out of student housing, and I told myself that revenge did not need to be loud to be effective. It needed to be accurate and patient. And the most accurate thing I could do was keep building a future that did not include them as beneficiaries or narrators, just witnesses who would have to watch from the sidewalk while I walked into my own life, and the very next morning, as if someone had been waiting for me to decide, I opened an email from a hiring manager who had seen my internship work and wanted to talk about an opening. And I stared at the screen with a feeling that was not quite hope and not quite relief, but something like momentum finally shifting in my direction, and I thought, fine, let us see what happens when I am no longer running uphill alone. Because I had a strange sense that this was the moment everything would start to turn and that the people who ignored me would soon remember my number for reasons that had nothing to do with love. When that email turned into an interview and the interview turned into an offer that did not promise miracles, but did promise steady hours, real health insurance, and a manager who looked me in the eye and said that grit mattered here, I accepted with a kind of quiet relief that felt like standing on solid ground after years of balancing on a moving floor. And from the first week, I decided that if no one had ever built a safety net for me, then I would build one for myself with the boring tools people rarely brag about, which meant automatic transfers to savings the moment each paycheck landed, a list of debts ranked by interest like a hit parade I was determined to retire one by one, a calendar of professional goals taped inside a cabinet door, and a new habit of asking for feedback even when it made me cringe, because I had learned that the only thing worse than hearing where you fall short is never learning how to get better. I watched the people who carried influence without raising their voices, and I started copying the parts that were teachable, the way they summarized a messy meeting in a single useful paragraph, the way they kept promises so that small projects snowballed into big ones, the way they protected their teams in public and delivered the hard truth in private, and as months turned into more than a year, the email threads with my name on them moved from the shallow end of errands into the deeper water of decisions. And while I never forgot the person who served coffee at dawn to make rent, I also stopped sabotaging myself with the idea that success belonged to other families with other last names. It helped that I found a mentor in a director named Laura who said, with the kind of calm that makes you believe her, that good work compounds like interest if you stop waiting for permission to invest. And under her I learned to handle conflict without setting anything on fire, to document agreements so that slippery memories could not rewrite them later, and to negotiate not from desperation but from value, which is a very different posture and one that changes how rooms react to you. And when my first promotion came through, I did not celebrate with flashy purchases because I had made a promise to my future self, so I used the raise to pay down the highest interest loan, increased the contribution to my emergency fund, and tucked away enough to start considering a place of my own, not because I was chasing status, but because I wanted the kind of stability no one could yank away with a sulky mood or a shifted priority. The day my offer on a small condo was accepted, I sat in the empty living room and let myself breathe for a long moment, not because the room was pretty or the light was perfect, but because the keys in my pocket were proof that I could build a life with no one holding the ladder steady for me. And I will tell you something that still makes me laugh without humor. Within a week of closing, relatives I had not heard from in years rediscovered my number, and my parents, who had ignored graduation, who had watched me work 2 and 3 jobs without a word of help, suddenly wanted to take me to dinner to catch up. I went because I wanted to hear the sales pitch before I priced it, and the conversation played out exactly as I expected, with my dad beginning on a warm note about how proud he was that I had found my lane, my stepmom chiming in about how family should support family, a phrase that sounded like a warning more than a comfort, and then the turn, casual on the surface and predatory underneath, where they mentioned that Hannah and her fiancé were planning a wedding that would be tasteful but not cheap, and that it would mean so much if I could take on a few of the larger costs, perhaps the venue deposit or the music, just to keep everything in the family spirit. And while I stirred my drink slowly to give myself the extra seconds to decide whether to laugh or to cry, I realized I was done bargaining with people who believed my worth was measurable only when it served their plans. I told them, in a measured tone that even surprised me, that my financial support would continue exactly as it had begun, which meant fully committed to my own future and not available for projects that required me to pretend history had not happened. And when my dad tried to bring up the idea of an inheritance, as if dangling a bone in front of a dog, I said that the only legacy I wanted was the one I could give to the person I used to be, the girl who wrote scholarship essays in the library at midnight because her parents would not help, and then I excused myself to use the restroom and, standing in the hallway with the noise of the dining room muffled behind a door, I took out my phone and made a donation to the university emergency fund that keeps students from dropping out over a broken laptop or a late fee, setting it up to recur every month in an amount that would have covered a wedding band with room to spare, and I wrote the gift in honor of students whose families believe independence means abandonment. When I returned to the table, I did not make a speech because I no longer needed their recognition to validate my choices. But the next morning, I sent my father and stepmother a brief email with the donation confirmation attached and a single line that said, "This is the only kind of family duty I recognize." And within minutes, my phone lit up with calls I did not answer. And later, a message arrived that called me ungrateful in more words than I care to repeat, but I simply archived it and went back to my work, where an unexpected meeting request from senior leadership sat on my calendar like a door waiting to be opened. And as I accepted the invite, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a chess move that looked small but reshaped the board. Because while they were busy planning a wedding on the assumption that I would help pay for a day I was not invited to plan, I was busy planning a future where their opinion had no power over my wallet, my name, or my sleep. And when the promotion that came out of that meeting pushed my salary into the range people whisper about, I kept that news to myself and bought a new notebook instead. The kind you use when you are ready to draft the next phase of a plan you have been building since the day you heard a man brag about buying someone else a house. And as the congratulatory emails rolled in from colleagues who actually knew what it cost to get here, my phone buzzed again with my father's number, and I answered with a warmth I did not feel and said, "Sure, let us have dinner again and talk about the future." Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge begins with letting people believe they still know your price. When we sat down at that next dinner, I already knew exactly how the evening would unfold, because people who are consistent in their neglect are almost always consistent in their motives when they suddenly change course, and my parents, who had treated me like background noise through the most vulnerable years of my life, were now performing this clumsy play of affection that could have fooled a stranger but could never fool me, since I had lived long enough under their roof to recognize the cadence of manipulation dressed up as care. My dad leaned in with that performative fatherly pride, congratulating me for how far I had come, repeating phrases like self-made and resilient, as if those qualities were badges he had pinned on me himself. And my stepmom kept inserting little reminders about how important family is when life gets busy, her voice sweet on the surface, but sharpened by the kind of entitlement that expects to be rewarded just for existing near someone else's achievements. I stirred my drink slowly and let them circle their performance, waiting, because the request always comes, and true to form it slid into the conversation after the plates were cleared, subtle in tone but obvious in intent, with my dad casually mentioning that Hannah and her husband had been struggling a bit with their mortgage and how stressful it was for young couples to carry that weight alone. And then came the suggestion, framed as a question, but delivered like an assumption, that maybe I could help them out since I was in such a stable position. I let them keep talking because it fascinated me how easily they rewrote history in real time, as if the years of silence and rejection could be swept off the table with a few lines about how proud they were of my independence. And when I asked them if they remembered the day they told me they could not spare a dollar for my tuition, my dad actually laughed like it was a joke from long ago, saying they had done the best they could and that times were different now, which was both insulting and oddly clarifying, because it reminded me that they had never seen me as someone with needs worth meeting, only as someone who could one day be converted into an asset if the circumstances lined up. My stepmom then brought up inheritance, not in a direct way but with a careful hint that generosity now would ensure security later, and in that moment I knew that they thought of me as an account they could invest in, not as a daughter they had failed. and I smiled politely because I understood that. Showing any anger would only give them power, while keeping calm and listening was the first step in building the evidence I would need for the move I was planning. Over the weeks that followed, the calls increased, the messages grew warmer, and suddenly I was being invited to barbecues and birthdays and holiday gatherings I had never mattered enough to attend in years past. And it would have been almost flattering if I did not know the math behind it, the equation where my paycheck equaled their chance to unload Hannah's financial mistakes onto someone else's shoulders. At work, colleagues started noticing how often I would step outside for a quick call, but none of them knew that I was answering my dad's questions about what kind of loan terms I thought were best or listening to my stepmom tell me how family investments always pay back in love, and instead of arguing, I kept my tone pleasant and agreeable because I had already decided that I was not going to cut them off abruptly. I was going to let them believe they had me exactly where they wanted. So that when the final move came, it would land harder and leave no room for their narrative to twist it. One evening after another of these exhausting family dinners, where the conversation circled yet again to Hannah's financial stress and how lucky I was not to face such burdens, I stopped by the office of an attorney recommended by my mentor, someone who specialized in estate planning and financial protections, and I explained my entire story with a kind of blunt honesty I had never used before, because I wanted every clause, every paragraph, every document to reflect the truth that I owed nothing to people who had refused me at every critical moment of my life. The attorney listened carefully, asked sharp questions, and by the time I left I felt a strange sense of power I had not realized I was missing, because in those signed documents I was carving out a future where my money, my property, and my legacy were insulated from manipulation, where my parents' names would not appear on a single line that could give them access to what I had built. The next time they invited me over for dinner, I brought dessert and a smile, because I knew more than they did now, and as I sat through another round of thinly disguised fishing for help, I thought about the pages locked in my safe deposit box. Pages that ensured they could talk about inheritance and loyalty all they wanted, but in the end they would never see a dime of what they had tried to dismiss when I needed it most. By the time I left that night, hugging them goodbye with practiced politeness, I felt almost detached, because I had stopped needing their approval or even their acknowledgement. I was simply waiting for the right moment to let them know that their entire campaign had been a waste, and the satisfaction of holding that knowledge in silence was more powerful than any outburst could have been. The cliffhanger came not from what they said, but from what they assumed, because as my dad walked me to the car, he clapped my shoulder with that faux fatherly pride and told me he knew I would do the right thing for the family, and I smiled so warmly that he believed me, which was perfect, because the right thing for the family had already been done in a lawyer's office with my signature and a notary stamp, and the only thing left was to decide how and when to let them know that they had been outplayed by the daughter they once told was not worth a single dollar. When the time finally came to reveal the truth I had been quietly arranging behind the scenes, it did not happen in a burst of anger or a heated confrontation, but rather in the calm and deliberate setting of a family dinner where my father, my stepmother, and Hannah were all present, each of them speaking as though it were inevitable that I would soon become the financial backbone of their household, and as though the struggles that had defined my early years without their support had been nothing more than an inconvenient detail best left in the past. I listened as my father once again congratulated me on how well I had done for myself, repeating the phrase, "We always knew you'd succeed," with a smug certainty that implied they had somehow played a role in it. And I let my stepmother's syrupy voice float over the table as she spoke about how family was supposed to look after one another, and how Hannah deserved stability now that she was planning a family of her own, and I sat quietly, nodding at the right moments, letting them believe the performance was working, because the weight of what I was about to say was going to drop harder if it arrived after they had built their fantasy future entirely around my supposed generosity. When my father shifted the conversation toward specifics, bringing up how helpful it would be if I could contribute toward paying off a portion of Hannah's mortgage, and how that would allow her and her husband to focus on starting a family without the crushing burden of debt, I placed my fork down slowly, folded my hands, and told them in a steady voice that I needed them to listen without interrupting. They fell silent, though I could see the impatience already flashing across my stepmother's face, as though she could not imagine that anything I had to say would be of importance unless it ended with a check. I began by reminding them of the day they told me I was not worth even $1 for my college education, the day I was told independence was a virtue when in truth it was just a convenient excuse for their neglect. And I reminded them how I had worked 3 jobs while they furnished Hannah's apartment and celebrated her vacations. I spoke clearly and without hesitation, making sure they could not escape into denial, and I watched the discomfort rise in the room as the walls they had built to shield themselves from accountability began to crack. Then, with a calmness that surprised even me, I explained that during the past months, while they had been flattering me with dinners and calls and endless messages about family loyalty, I had been meeting with an attorney. And together we had drawn up documents that made it impossible for them to ever touch a cent of what I had earned, either now or in the future. I told them that my will had been rewritten to exclude them entirely, that my estate plan directed everything I owned toward causes and people who had actually shown me care when I needed it, and that there was no path left for them to claim a share of my success. No loophole, no technicality, nothing at all. My stepmother gasped and began to protest that I was being cruel, that I was betraying family, while my father's face hardened into a look I had seen before, the look of a man who cannot believe his control is slipping, and Hannah sat frozen, her eyes wide as if she had only just realized that the well she had been promised would never exist. I told them I did not owe them forgiveness, that I did not owe them my success, and that I certainly did not owe them my money, because what they had shown me was not parenting but favoritism, not love but calculation. And while I had accepted their decision long ago, I had also promised myself that when the day came that they looked to me for support, I would make sure the answer was as empty as the promises they gave me. My father raised his voice then, calling me ungrateful, insisting that parents deserve loyalty no matter what, but I interrupted him for the first time in years, cutting him off mid-sentence to say that loyalty is earned by actions, not by blood, and that they had made their choice when they told me I was not worth the investment, and now I had made mine. The silence that followed was thick and unbreakable, and in that silence I felt a weight leave me that I had been carrying since the day I overheard my father bragging about buying Hannah a house, because finally I had returned the message in kind. You will never benefit from what I built, not now, not ever. I stood up, thanked them for dinner, and walked out, and though my stepmother called after me and my father barked my name, I did not turn around, because I knew there was nothing left to say. That night, as I locked my own front door behind me, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, not the fragile peace of compromise, but the steady peace of boundaries finally held, and I realized that the most brilliant revenge is not loud or messy, but clean and final, and theirs would be knowing for the rest of their lives that the daughter they once dismissed had not only outgrown their control, but had outsmarted every attempt to reclaim it. And though part of me wondered if they would ever reflect on their choices, the truth is I did not care, because reflection was their burden to carry, while mine was the freedom of knowing that I had turned their neglect into the very shield that now kept them locked out forever.